little black girl walks into a store, but she's falsely accused of stealing. The racist saleswoman violently hits her, and the police put her in handcuffs. All of this happens in a store owned by her father. What happens next will shock you. Watch until the end, hit subscribe, and comment, how would you react if you were her father? The luxurious jewelry store gleamed under the soft lights that reflected off polished glass and sparkling gems. Amelia stood in awe, her dark eyes wide as she gazed through the thick display cases at the dazzling rings, necklaces, and earrings inside. She was 11 years old, small for her age, with tight braids falling down her back and a quiet curiosity about the world. This was her father's store, but to her it felt like stepping into a fairy tale. She loved visiting it after school, wandering through the aisles while her father worked in his office, overseeing the business. Today, however, her father wasn't around. He had stepped out for an important meeting, leaving Amelia to her own devices in the front showroom. She didn't mind. She loved looking at the beautiful jewelry that seemed to sparkle with a kind of magic. She felt a sense of peace, of wonder, every time she stepped inside. Today, however, that peace would be shattered in a way she couldn't have expected. As Amelia slowly moved between the display cases, her fingers tracing the smooth glass, she became aware of someone watching her. She glanced up and saw the new saleswoman, a tall white woman with sharp features and a disapproving frown, staring at her. Amelia had seen her a few times before, but had never spoken to her. The woman's name was Miss White, and she always seemed cold and distant, even when Amelia's father was in the store. Amelia tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling of being watched, her gaze drifting back to the displays. She spotted a beautiful pair of diamond earrings, small, delicate, and shimmering like stars. Her eyes lit up, and she leaned closer to get a better look. It was then that it happened. As she leaned in, her hand brushed against the edge of the display, and one of the earrings slipped from its delicate stand. Before she could react, the small piece of jewelry hit the glass shelf and tumbled to the floor with a quiet clink. Amelia froze. Her heart began to race as she crouched down to pick it up, her small hands shaking. Before she could even touch the earring, Miss White was upon her. "What do you think you're doing?" The woman's voice was sharp, harsh. Amelia looked up, her eyes wide with fear. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to drop it," she stammered, her voice trembling. Miss White sneered. "Didn't mean to drop it? Or didn't mean to steal it, Her words dripped with accusation. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. "I wasn't trying to steal it. It was an accident, I swear." But Miss White wasn't listening. Her eyes were filled with contempt as she took a step closer, towering over the young girl. "I knew it the moment you walked in here. People like you don't belong in a place like this," she spat, her voice low and dangerous. "You thought you could just take what you wanted, didn't you?" Amelia shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. No, I wasn't trying to—" Her words were cut off by a sharp slap across her face. The sound echoed through the quiet store, and Amelia stumbled backward, clutching her cheek. The force of the blow sent her reeling, and she fell to the ground, her back hitting the cold marble floor with a painful thud. She lay there for a moment, too shocked to move, tears streaming down her face as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. Miss White stood over her, breathing heavily, her hand still raised. The look in her eyes was one of satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the chance to unleash her hatred on someone weaker, someone she considered beneath her. Amelia whimpered, her small body trembling. Her cheek stung from the slap, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to hide, but her body wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, overwhelmed by fear and pain. Miss White leaned down, her voice a cruel whisper. "You're nothing but a little thief, and thieves get what they deserve." Before Amelia could respond, Miss White straightened up and pulled out her phone. She dialed the police, her voice calm and composed, as if she were reporting a minor inconvenience. "Yes, I'd like to report an attempted theft at the jewelry store. We have a young girl here. She tried to steal one of our diamond earrings. Yes, I've restrained her. Please send someone immediately." Amelia's heart sank. The police? She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't tried to steal anything. It was just an accident. But Miss White wasn't listening, and the police were already on their way. "Please," Amelia whimpered, struggling to sit up. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to—" "Shut up," Miss White snapped, glaring down at her. "I don't want to hear your lies. The police will deal with you." Amelia sobbed quietly, her small body shaking as she hugged her knees to her chest. She had never felt so scared, so helpless in her life. The door to the store opened with a jingle, and 2 police officers stepped inside. They were tall, imposing, their uniforms crisp and their expressions stern. They took one look at Amelia, still sitting on the floor with tears streaming down her face, and then turned to Miss White. "She's the one," Miss White said, her voice filled with righteous indignation. "She tried to steal that diamond earring. I caught her red-handed." The officers exchanged glances, then approached Amelia. One of them crouched down in front of her, his eyes hard. "Is this true, young lady? Did you try to steal that earring?" Amelia shook her head frantically, the tears blurring her vision. "No, I didn't. It was an accident. I didn't mean to drop it." The officer's face remained impassive. "You're going to have to come with us," he said coldly. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. "What? No, please, I didn't do anything." The other officer grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. Amelia cried out in pain, but the officers didn't seem to care. They forced her hands behind her back and slapped cold metal handcuffs around her small wrists. The sound of the cuffs clicking into place was deafening in Amelia's ears. It felt unreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. How could this be happening? How could they think she was a thief? "No, please," Amelia cried, struggling against the tight grip of the officers. "I didn't steal anything." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers began to drag her toward the door, her small body stumbling as they pulled her along. She looked back at Miss White, hoping for some kind of reprieve, but the woman only smirked, satisfied with the chaos she had caused. Amelia's world spun as the officers shoved her into the back of the police car, slamming the door behind her. She sat there, trembling and sobbing, her wrists aching from the cuffs. She had never been so scared in her life. The back seat of the police car was cold and uncomfortable. Amelia could feel the metal of the handcuffs biting into her wrists even though she tried her best not to move. The tears that had soaked her cheeks had dried, but new ones were already threatening to spill over as she struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Her mind was racing, her chest tight with fear, but there was nothing she could do. She had been taken from her father's store, the place that had always felt safe and familiar in a way that made her feel like a criminal, even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. The car sped through the streets as Amelia stared out the window, watching the city blur past her. She had never been in a police car before, and she could hardly believe this was happening. She was just a little girl, and now she was in handcuffs, like she was dangerous, like she had done something terrible. But it was an accident. It had only been an accident. Her heart pounded as she thought about what would happen next. Would they take her to jail? Would she be locked up with real criminals? She couldn't stop the trembling in her hands, and her breath came in shallow gasps as she fought against the rising panic. The police car came to a stop outside the store, and the two officers who had taken her climbed out, slamming their doors behind them. Amelia pressed herself into the corner of the back seat, wishing she could disappear. She couldn't bear the thought of facing them again, but the sound of their voices, low and authoritative, snapped her back to reality. One of the officers opened the back door, and she could see Miss White standing on the sidewalk, waiting with a self-satisfied smirk on her face. "Come on, out you go," the officer barked, grabbing Amelia by the arm and yanking her out of the car. Her small body stumbled forward, her feet barely catching her as she was pulled onto the pavement. Miss White didn't even glance at her, her eyes trained on the officers as if she was in charge. "I told you, she's a thief," she said, her voice full of certainty. "I caught her trying to steal one of our diamond earrings. I did the right thing calling you." The officer holding Amelia's arm nodded grimly. "We'll take care of it," he said. Amelia's stomach churned with fear. They believed her. They actually believed Miss White, even though none of it was true. One of the officers bent down to look her in the eye. "You need to start telling the truth, young lady," he said in a tone that made it clear he didn't expect anything but a confession. "Did you take that earring?" Amelia shook her head frantically. "No, I didn't. It was an accident, I swear." But her words seemed to bounce off them unnoticed. The other officer glanced at Miss White, who nodded approvingly. "That's what they all say," she muttered under her breath. Amelia's heart sank deeper into her chest. She felt trapped, helpless, like there was nothing she could do to make them believe her. It was as if the truth didn't matter. They had already decided what she was, and nothing she could say would change their minds. The officer who had questioned her straightened up and turned back to his partner. "Let's take her inside, get everything sorted out." Amelia's heart raced even faster. Inside? Back into the store? She'd already been humiliated once. What would they do now? Without another word, they marched her back into the jewelry store, her feet dragging as she struggled to keep up with their long strides. The store looked exactly the same as it had just moments ago, before her world had turned upside down. But now, everything felt different. The lights were too bright, the polished surfaces too cold and sterile. It was no longer a place of wonder. It was a place of fear. Miss White followed behind them, her heels clicking on the marble floor with a sound that made Amelia's stomach churn. The officer gestured toward a small corner near the front counter, where he motioned for her to sit down on one of the stools. He placed a hand on her shoulder, pressing her down as if to remind her that she wasn't going anywhere. Amelia sat stiffly, her body tense with anxiety. She wanted to scream, to run, to cry out for help, but her voice seemed trapped in her throat. All she could do was sit and watch as Miss White began talking to the officers, explaining in vivid detail how she had caught Amelia in the act of stealing the earring. "She's been in here before," Miss White said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I've seen her looking around, eyeing the jewelry. I knew something wasn't right the moment she walked in." The officers nodded along, taking notes as she spoke, their faces serious and focused. Amelia watched in horror as the lies piled up higher and higher. How could they believe this? How could they not see that none of it was true? Suddenly, the door to the store opened, and Amelia's heart leapt into her throat. It was her father. He walked in, looking calm and composed as always. But as soon as his eyes landed on the scene in front of him, his daughter in handcuffs, the police standing over her, and Miss White talking animatedly to them, his expression darkened. "What's going on here?" His voice was low, but there was a dangerous edge to it that made everyone pause. Miss White turned to face him, a smug smile spreading across her lips. "Mr. Johnson, I'm glad you're here. I've taken care of everything. This girl," she gestured toward Amelia without even bothering to look at her, "was caught trying to steal one of our diamond earrings. I called the police, and they've handled the situation." Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking between the police officers and his daughter, who sat frozen, her eyes wide with fear. "This girl," he repeated, his voice growing colder by the second. Miss White nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, sir, I did what I had to do. She was a thief, after all." There was a moment of stunned silence as Mr. Johnson processed her words. And then, without warning, his entire demeanor shifted. His face tightened with barely contained rage, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That girl," he said slowly, his voice shaken with fury, "is my daughter." Miss White's eyes widened in shock, her smug smile vanishing in an instant. What?" she stammered, her voice trembling. Amelia watched as her father stepped forward, his entire body radiating anger. "My daughter," he repeated, each word dripping with venom. "And you called the police on her? You accused her of stealing?" Miss White stumbled backward, her face paling as she realized the gravity of her mistake. I didn't know, sir. I thought—" Mr. Johnson didn't let her finish. He turned to the officers, his voice sharp and commanding. "Take those handcuffs off my daughter, now." The officers hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. "Sir, we were just following the protocol based on the accusations. I said, take them off," Mr. Johnson snapped, his patience gone. The officers, now clearly uncomfortable, moved quickly to unlock the handcuffs, freeing Amelia from their grip. She rubbed her sore wrists, blinking back tears as she looked up at her father with a mixture of relief and fear. Mr. Johnson knelt down in front of her, his expression softening as he gently touched her cheek. "Are you all right, baby girl?" he asked quietly. Amelia nodded, her voice too shaky to speak. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest as she sobbed quietly. He held her close, his anger momentarily pushed aside as he comforted his daughter. But the moment of calm didn't last long. Mr. Johnson stood up, his eyes locking onto Miss White, who stood frozen, too terrified to move. "You're fired," he said, his voice low and deadly. "Get out of my store." Miss White opened her mouth to protest, but the look in Mr. Johnson's eyes silenced her. She nodded weakly, her face pale as she turned to leave. As she walked toward the door, one of the officers cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson, we can't let her go just yet. There's been an accusation and we need to investigate." "There's nothing to investigate," Mr. Johnson interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You've already done enough damage." Miss White's hands trembled as she pulled her phone out of her pocket, but she managed to keep her expression calm. Her heart raced, the reality of what she had done finally starting to settle in. She had just slapped a young girl and accused her of stealing. She hadn't known the girl was Mr. Johnson's daughter, and now she was starting to regret how quickly she had acted. But there was no turning back now. Her fingers shook as she dialed Mr. Johnson's number. She had worked for him for only a few months, but his reputation preceded him. He was a man of discipline, fairness, and strict professionalism. Miss White knew he didn't tolerate mistakes, but she hoped her quick action in reporting the theft would win her favor. After all, wasn't she just protecting his store? As the phone rang, she stole a glance at the officers, who were now standing near Amelia, though they still seemed unsure about the situation. Amelia sat quietly, her body trembling slightly, her wrists red from where the handcuffs had been. Miss White pushed the image out of her mind. She had to keep the narrative in her favor, had to stay in control. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. Johnson's deep voice came through the phone. "Mr. Johnson speaking." Miss White straightened her back, her voice taking on a more confident tone than she felt. "Mr. Johnson, it's Miss White, sir. I wanted to inform you that we had a situation at the store today." "A situation?" His voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it that made her feel as though she were already on thin ice. "Yes, sir. A young girl came in and, well, she attempted to steal a diamond earring from the display. I caught her in the act and called the police, who are here now handling the matter. I wanted to make sure you knew right away." She kept her tone measured, trying to emphasize her professionalism, hoping that it would distract him from any doubts he might have. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Miss White held her breath, waiting for his reaction. "You caught a thief?" Mr. Johnson asked slowly, as though he were processing the information carefully. "Yes, sir," she replied quickly. "A little girl, around 11 years old. She was eyeing the jewelry for a while, and I suspected something was off. When she dropped one of the earrings, I confronted her, and she became defensive. I had no choice but to call the police." Miss White could hear him exhale sharply, and she swallowed hard. "Good work, Miss White," he said after a moment, his voice regaining its usual calm authority. "You did the right thing by calling the police. I appreciate you keeping an eye on things. The store's security is a priority, and I will make sure you are rewarded for your diligence." Miss White's shoulders sagged in relief. "Thank you, sir. I just wanted to make sure everything was taken care of." "I'm on my way there now," Mr. Johnson continued. "I'll be there in a few minutes to handle the situation personally." Miss White's relief grew stronger, and she felt a sense of victory wash over her. She had made the right call. Her boss was clearly impressed, and that would surely mean some sort of reward, perhaps a bonus, or at the very least his approval. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I'll await your arrival," she said, her voice laced with gratitude. She hung up the phone and turned to face the officers, the faintest trace of a smile curling at the edges of her lips. "Mr. Johnson is on his way now. He's aware of everything." The officers nodded, but they still looked somewhat uncomfortable. It was as if they weren't entirely sure what to do next, as though they could sense something wasn't quite right with the situation but couldn't put their finger on it. Miss White ignored their uncertainty and returned her gaze to Amelia, who sat still on the stool, her face pale and tear-streaked. The girl's small form seemed even smaller now, and for a moment Miss White hesitated. Was it possible she had misjudged the situation? Maybe she had been too quick to act, but no, she shook the thought from her mind. She was in control here. She had made the call, and her boss had backed her up. The minutes dragged on, the tension in the store growing thicker as they waited for Mr. Johnson to arrive. The officers stood off to the side, occasionally glancing at each other as if exchanging silent questions, but they didn't move to release Amelia or investigate further. It seemed they were content to let Mr. Johnson handle things when he arrived. And then the door opened. Mr. Johnson stepped into the store, his tall, commanding figure immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the room. He was dressed in a sharp suit, as always, his presence exuding authority. Miss White's confidence surged at the sight of him. This was her chance to explain everything, to show him that she had acted in the best interest of the store. "Mr. Johnson," she called out, her voice bright with false cheer, "I'm so glad you're here." But Mr. Johnson didn't respond immediately. His dark eyes scanned the room, taking in the officers, the store, and finally settling on Amelia. For a split second, confusion flickered across his face, and then he saw the handcuffs. His face darkened, his eyes narrowing as the pieces fell into place. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice suddenly hard, cutting through the air like a blade. Miss White hesitated, the rehearsed explanation she had planned suddenly feeling inadequate. "Sir, this girl—" But Mr. Johnson wasn't listening. He moved forward, his gaze locked on Amelia, who was sitting rigidly on the stool, her tearful eyes wide with fear. "Amelia?" he asked, his voice low but laced with a growing anger. Amelia looked up at her father, her lower lip trembling. "Daddy, I didn't do anything. I swear." Mr. Johnson's jaw clenched as he turned back toward Miss White. "What did you do?" His voice was controlled, but there was a deadly undertone that made Miss White's stomach drop. Miss White opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The reality of what she had done began to hit her like a wave. She had accused the boss's daughter of theft. She had called the police on her. She had slapped her. I thought," she stammered, her voice cracking. "You thought?" Mr. Johnson's voice was icy, his gaze never leaving her. "You thought my daughter was a thief?" Miss White's face flushed with panic as she realized the full extent of her mistake. "Sir, I didn't know she was your daughter. I saw her drop the earring, and I thought—" "You thought wrong." Mr. Johnson cut her off, his voice dangerously calm. He turned to the officers, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Take those handcuffs off my daughter, now." The officers, who had been standing silently throughout the exchange, seemed to snap out of their daze. One of them quickly moved forward, fumbling with the keys as he unlocked the cuffs from Amelia's wrists. The second officer stepped back, visibly uncomfortable with how the situation had unfolded. Amelia rubbed her sore wrists, the skin red and raw where the metal had pressed against her. She glanced up at her father, her eyes brimming with tears, and then threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. Mr. Johnson held her tightly, his anger simmering just below the surface as he looked over her head at Miss White. "You accused my daughter of stealing?" he repeated, his voice low and filled with controlled fury. "You called the police on her?" Miss White could only nod, her throat tight with fear. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Johnson's eyes flashed with anger. "You should have known better," he said coldly. "You're fired. Get out of my store." Miss White's heart sank. "Please, sir, I said get out." His voice left no room for negotiation. "Now." Miss White hesitated for only a moment longer before turning on her heel and walking quickly toward the door, her head bowed in shame. As she left the store, the officers watched her go, their faces a mixture of discomfort and unease. They had been complicit in this, and they knew it. Once Miss White was gone, Mr. Johnson turned back to the officers. "I don't care what she told you," he said firmly. "My daughter didn't steal anything. This was all a mistake, and I expect an apology." The officers exchanged nervous glances before one of them stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Johnson, we're sorry. We were just following the report we received. We didn't realize." "You didn't realize?" Mr. Johnson's voice was harsh. "You didn't even bother to check the facts." The officer swallowed hard. "We didn't mean any harm, sir." "Get out," Mr. Johnson said quietly, but with enough force to make them understand there was no further discussion. The officers quickly left the store, leaving Mr. Johnson standing there with his daughter still clinging to him. As the door closed behind them, he exhaled deeply, his anger slowly giving way to a deep sense of relief that it was over. But it wasn't over for Miss White. The store felt eerily quiet after the police officers left, as if the air itself was thick with the tension that still lingered. Mr. Johnson stood there, holding his daughter tightly, his mind racing to catch up with what had just unfolded. His emotions swirled inside him: rage, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of protectiveness for Amelia. He gently pulled back from their embrace, crouching down to look her in the eyes. "Are you okay, baby girl?" he asked, his voice softer now, laced with concern. Amelia nodded weakly, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. She looked down, her hands trembling as they fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. The marks from the handcuffs were still visible on her wrists, and Mr. Johnson's heart twisted painfully at the sight. "I didn't steal anything, Daddy," she whispered, her voice so small that it almost broke him. "It was an accident, I swear. I didn't mean to drop the earring." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his anger toward Miss White boiling back up to the surface. "I know, sweetheart. I know you didn't do anything wrong." Mr. Johnson straightened up and turned his gaze toward the front door where Miss White had disappeared. The weight of the situation hit him fully now. His own employee had accused his daughter, his own flesh and blood, of theft. Not only had she made a false accusation, but she had also called the police and put his child through a nightmare that no child should ever experience. And worse yet, he had initially praised her for it, not knowing the full extent of her actions. His jaw tightened, and he felt the anger rise again, but he knew that lashing out wouldn't help Amelia right now. What mattered most was that she was safe, and that Miss White would face the consequences of her actions. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and then guided Amelia over to the front counter where he could sit her down for a moment. "Stay here, okay?" he said softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I'll take care of everything." Amelia nodded, her eyes still filled with the lingering fear of the ordeal she had just been through. She watched as her father moved to the center of the store, his shoulders squared and his expression determined. As Mr. Johnson paced the floor, he mentally replayed the events of the last hour, trying to piece together how this had all spiraled so horribly out of control. Miss White had acted out of ignorance, out of prejudice, and, worst of all, she had let her racist assumptions dictate her actions. But this was more than just about Miss White. This was about the police who had so quickly jumped to conclusions. This was about a system that allowed something like this to happen in the first place. Just as these thoughts churned in his mind, the door to the store opened again, and, to his surprise, Miss White hesitantly walked back inside. Her face was pale, and the confident smirk she had worn earlier was long gone. She seemed to know what was coming, but had likely returned in a last-ditch effort to save her job, or perhaps to defend her actions. Mr. Johnson's eyes locked onto hers, and the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken fury. "What are you doing here?" he asked coldly, his voice steady but with an edge that made Miss White flinch. I came back to explain," she stammered, her voice shaky as she nervously clasped her hands in front of her. "Mr. Johnson, I swear, I didn't know that she was your daughter. If I had known—" "If you had known?" Mr. Johnson interrupted, his voice rising ever so slightly. "That's your defense? You're telling me that if it had been some other little black girl, your actions would have been justified?" Miss White's eyes widened, and she struggled to find the right words. No, sir, that's not what I meant. I thought I was doing the right thing by protecting the store." "Protecting the store?" Mr. Johnson repeated incredulously. "By slapping an innocent child? By calling the police on her for an accident? Do you even hear yourself?" Miss White's face reddened with embarrassment, and her eyes darted toward Amelia, who was sitting quietly behind the counter, her tear-streaked face a silent reminder of what had transpired. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have. I didn't mean for things to go this far." Mr. Johnson's jaw clenched. "It's too late for apologies, Miss White. You crossed a line that you can't uncross. You let your prejudice blind you to the truth, and because of that, my daughter suffered." Miss White opened her mouth to protest, but Mr. Johnson held up a hand to silence her. "You're fired," he said, his voice firm and final. "I want you out of this store immediately. And don't expect any references or final payments. You've done enough damage." Tears welled up in Miss White's eyes, and she began to plead, her voice desperate. "Please, sir, I can't lose this job. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I don't want to hear any more excuses," Mr. Johnson snapped, his patience running thin. "You should have thought about the consequences of your actions before you decided to treat my daughter like a criminal." Miss White hesitated for a moment longer, but the reality of the situation finally seemed to sink in. She nodded weakly, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'm sorry," she muttered one last time before turning and walking toward the door. As she reached for the handle, the door suddenly swung open, and the same two police officers who had left earlier re-entered the store. Their expressions were grim, and it was clear that they hadn't expected to be back so soon. "Mr. Johnson," one of the officers said, his voice cautious, "we just received a call from headquarters. We're here to take a formal statement from your employee about the assault on your daughter." Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow, his anger briefly giving way to curiosity. "A formal statement?" The officer nodded, his gaze shifting to Miss White. "We've been informed that this situation needs to be investigated further. There's been an accusation of assault against a minor, and we need to gather all the details." Miss White's face drained of all color, and she took a step back, her hands trembling. "Assault?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to. But the officers were already moving toward her, their expressions cold and professional. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs, while the other read Miss White her rights. "You're being placed under arrest for assaulting a minor," the officer said firmly. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Miss White's breath hitched, and she looked helplessly at Mr. Johnson, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, sir," she begged. "I didn't mean to hurt her. It was all a misunderstanding. But Mr. Johnson's face remained impassive. He watched as the officers placed the handcuffs around her wrists, their movements swift and efficient. It was only fitting, he thought, that the woman who had subjected his daughter to such cruelty would now face the consequences of her own actions. As the officers led Miss White toward the door, she glanced back at Mr. Johnson one last time, her face filled with regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but this time her words were barely audible. The door closed behind them, and the store was once again filled with an uneasy silence. Mr. Johnson exhaled slowly, feeling a strange sense of closure wash over him. Justice had been served, but it didn't take away the pain of what Amelia had endured. He walked back over to his daughter, who had been watching the scene unfold with wide, tearful eyes. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering sadness. "Is she gone?" Amelia asked softly. Mr. Johnson nodded, crouching down beside her once more. "She's gone," he said gently. "She won't hurt you again." Amelia bit her lip, her small body still trembling with the aftershocks of fear. "Daddy, I was so scared." Mr. Johnson pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she sobbed quietly against his chest. "I know, baby girl. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. But it's over now. You're safe." As he held her, the weight of the day finally began to lift, and for the first time since the ordeal had started, Mr. Johnson felt a sense of peace. His daughter was safe, and the woman who had hurt her was facing the consequences. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough. And for now, that was all that mattered. The air in the store still felt heavy, as though the tension from the recent events had sunk into every corner. Mr. Johnson stayed by Amelia's side, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. He could feel her small body shaking slightly, and it tore at his heart to know that she had been subjected to such cruelty. But, at least now, justice seemed to be in motion. Miss White had been arrested, and the officers were finally treating the situation with the seriousness it deserved. Mr. Johnson stood tall, his mind racing with thoughts of what had transpired. He replayed every detail from the moment Miss White accused his daughter to the police's blind acceptance of her lies. How had it come to this? How had his own employee, someone he had trusted to uphold the values of his store, turned out to be so filled with prejudice? And more importantly, how had the police, trained professionals, failed to see through such a blatant falsehood? He turned to Amelia, crouching down once more to meet her tear-filled eyes. "Are you sure you're okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. Amelia nodded, her voice still shaky. "I'm okay now, Daddy, but I was really scared. I thought they were going to take me to jail." Her voice cracked, and fresh tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke the words. Mr. Johnson's chest tightened, anger flaring once more at the thought of his innocent daughter being treated like a criminal. "No one's taken you anywhere," he said firmly. "You didn't do anything wrong. I won't let anyone hurt you like that ever again." Amelia gave a small nod, wiping her eyes. She clung to her father as if she were afraid that if she let go, the nightmare might start all over again. Mr. Johnson held her close, his own resolve hardening. This wasn't just about today. This was about ensuring that nothing like this ever happened again, not just to Amelia, but to anyone. Just then, the door to the store swung open again, and in walked a different figure, an officer in plain clothes. He carried himself with a sense of authority, his expression stern but not unkind. Behind him, the two uniformed officers from earlier re-entered, their demeanor noticeably more respectful. "Mr. Johnson," the plainclothes officer said, stepping forward and extending his hand. "I'm Lieutenant Harris. I've been sent to oversee the investigation into what happened here today." Mr. Johnson stood, shaking the man's hand firmly, but his expression remained guarded. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant," he said, "but I want to make sure you understand what really happened here. My daughter was falsely accused, assaulted, and nearly arrested, all because of a racist employee who jumped to the wrong conclusion. This was a case of prejudice, plain and simple." Lieutenant Harris nodded, his gaze flicking to Amelia for a brief moment before returning to Mr. Johnson. "I understand your concerns, sir, and I assure you we're taking this very seriously. Miss White has been taken into custody and we're gathering statements to make sure the proper charges are filed." Mr. Johnson folded his arms across his chest. "That's not enough. I want accountability from everyone involved in this, including your officers." He gestured toward the two uniformed policemen standing behind Harris. "They didn't just take her word for it, they acted on it, without even giving my daughter a chance to defend herself." The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that they had made a mistake. One of them, Officer Reynolds, stepped forward, his expression tight with regret. "Mr. Johnson, we're sorry for how things played out. We were responding to the call as it came in and—" "Responding to the call?" Mr. Johnson interrupted, his voice filled with disbelief. "You put an 11-year-old girl in handcuffs. You believed everything Miss White told you, and you didn't even bother to ask my daughter for her side of the story. How is that responding?" The other officer, Officer Park, spoke up next. "It wasn't our intention to escalate the situation like this. We were following the protocols based on the accusations. And those accusations were lies," Mr. Johnson shot back. "You didn't even try to find out the truth." Lieutenant Harris raised a hand, stepping between Mr. Johnson and his officers. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Johnson, and believe me, this will be investigated thoroughly. We'll be reviewing the body cam footage from both officers and conducting an internal review. I give you my word, there will be consequences if we find that protocol was mishandled." Mr. Johnson narrowed his eyes. "It's not just about protocol, Lieutenant. It's about common sense and decency. My daughter was treated like a criminal because someone saw her skin color and assumed the worst. And your officers didn't question it." Lieutenant Harris held his gaze, unflinching. "And that's exactly why we're conducting a full investigation, sir. I promise you, this won't be swept under the rug." For a long moment, the two men stood facing each other, the weight of the situation heavy between them. Finally, Mr. Johnson exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He could see that Lieutenant Harris was serious about taking action, but it didn't make the sting of what had happened any less painful. "Fine," Mr. Johnson said at last, his voice measured, "but I expect transparency throughout this process, and I expect to be kept informed every step of the way." "Of course," Harris agreed. "I'll personally oversee the investigation and make sure you receive regular updates." Mr. Johnson nodded, though the tension in his chest remained. "Good." The officers stood quietly for a moment, and then Lieutenant Harris turned to Amelia, his expression softening. "Miss Johnson, I'm very sorry for what you went through today. No child should ever have to experience something like that. We'll do everything we can to make sure this is handled properly." Amelia looked up at the lieutenant, her wide eyes still filled with the remnants of fear. She didn't say anything, but she nodded slowly, her small hand gripping her father's tightly. With that, Lieutenant Harris gestured to the two uniformed officers, signaling for them to follow him out of the store. As they made their way to the door, Officer Reynolds paused and looked back at Mr. Johnson, his face filled with regret. Mr. Johnson again. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know it doesn't fix what happened, but I truly am sorry." Mr. Johnson didn't respond right away, his expression unreadable, but after a long pause he gave a short, curt nod. "Just make sure this never happens again." Officer Reynolds nodded solemnly before finally exiting the store with the others. As the door closed behind them, the store was once again silent, leaving Mr. Johnson and Amelia standing alone. The events of the day had been emotionally exhausting, and Mr. Johnson could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. He looked down at his daughter, who still clung to his side, and his heart ached for her. No child should ever have to endure what she had been through. But at the same time, he knew that this was far from over. There were still questions to be answered, justice to be sought, and changes that needed to be made. He couldn't let this end with just Miss White's arrest. He had to ensure that this became a catalyst for real change, not just in his store, but in how people like his daughter were treated in the world. He knelt down beside Amelia, gently cupping her face in his hands. "We're going to be okay," he whispered. "I promise you, this won't happen again." Amelia looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust, and for the first time since the ordeal had begun, she managed a small, tentative smile. "Daddy," she said quietly, "thank you for protecting me." Mr. Johnson's heart swelled with love and pride, and he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Always, baby girl," he whispered. "Always." As they stood there together in the quiet of the store, Mr. Johnson made a silent vow to himself. He would not let this be just another incident, another moment of injustice brushed aside. He would fight for his daughter, for others like her, and for a world where no child would ever have to feel the fear that Amelia had felt today. And he would make sure that Miss White, the police, and anyone else who had contributed to this nightmare would be held accountable, no matter how long it took. The days following the incident felt like a whirlwind, but Mr. Johnson remained resolute in his mission to see justice served. Amelia had returned to school, trying to resume her life as normally as she could, but Mr. Johnson could still see the unease in her eyes. Every time the door of the store opened with a chime, she flinched slightly. It wasn't something she could shake off so easily, and Mr. Johnson knew that no matter how much he tried to shield her, the scars from that day would take time to heal. The investigation into Miss White's actions was swift, thanks to the attention Mr. Johnson had demanded. The body cam footage from the police officers, as well as the store's own surveillance cameras, had provided a damning picture of the events. There was no question about Miss White's assault on Amelia, or about the baselessness of her accusations. The footage showed everything, from the moment Miss White had struck Amelia to the cold and dismissive manner in which she had treated her afterward. It had been enough to ensure that Miss White faced criminal charges. Assault, child endangerment, and false reporting were all being leveled against her. She had been denied bail, and her trial was set to take place in the coming weeks. Mr. Johnson had spent the last few days gathering his own legal team, determined not to let any detail slip through the cracks. His lawyers were among the best in the city, and they had assured him that justice would be swift and severe. But that wasn't enough for him. He didn't just want justice for Amelia. He wanted to make sure that no other child, no other person, would ever be subjected to the kind of cruelty and discrimination that had taken place in his store. The store itself had undergone changes as well. Every employee, from the cashiers to the sales associates, had been subjected to rigorous training on racial sensitivity and anti-discrimination policies. Mr. Johnson had made it clear that there would be zero tolerance for prejudice of any kind. He had personally overseen the retraining sessions, making sure that everyone understood the gravity of what had happened and what was at stake. But now, standing outside the courthouse, Mr. Johnson felt the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. The trial was about to begin, and Miss White was about to face the consequences of her actions. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for her, but for the system that had allowed such an incident to occur in the first place. As Mr. Johnson walked through the courthouse doors, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just here for Amelia. He was here for every child who had ever been unfairly treated, for every person who had been judged based on the color of their skin. This was about more than one incident. This was about systemic change. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Miss White sat at the defense table, looking much different than the confident woman who had once strutted around his store. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow with fear, and she kept glancing nervously around the room as if hoping for some kind of escape. But there was no escape now. The prosecutor stood and began outlining the case against Miss White, detailing her actions that day, her unjustified assault on Amelia, and her false claims to the police. The jury listened intently, their expressions growing more serious with each passing moment. Mr. Johnson watched Miss White closely. There was no sign of the arrogance she had shown that day in the store. Now, she was just a woman who had made a terrible mistake, and she knew it. But Mr. Johnson didn't feel pity. She had chosen to act on her prejudice, and she had chosen to let her hatred guide her actions. And now, she would face the consequences. The trial moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, and Miss White's defense was weak. Her attorney tried to argue that she had acted out of fear, that she had genuinely believed Amelia was a threat to the store. But the footage from the security cameras painted a very different picture. It was clear that Miss White had acted out of malice, not fear. Her actions had been driven by racism, pure and simple. Amelia had been spared from having to testify, something Mr. Johnson had insisted upon. She had already been through enough, and he didn't want to put her through the trauma of recounting the events in front of a courtroom full of strangers. Instead, the prosecutor relied on the video evidence and the testimony of the police officers, who had both admitted that they had acted too quickly without fully investigating the situation. By the end of the trial, it was clear that Miss White's fate was sealed. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. The relief that swept through Mr. Johnson's body was immediate, though it didn't erase the pain of what had happened. As the judge delivered Miss White's sentence, several years in prison for assault and false reporting, Mr. Johnson allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served, at least in part, but he knew this was just the beginning of the changes he wanted to see. After the trial, as Mr. Johnson and Amelia stood on the courthouse steps, the reporters who had gathered outside began asking questions. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved toward him, but Mr. Johnson held up a hand, signaling for silence. "I have one thing to say," he began, his voice steady and strong. "What happened to my daughter should never happen to anyone, anywhere." This was an act of hatred, driven by prejudice, and today justice was served. But this isn't just about Miss White. This is about making sure that our society, our police, our communities no longer tolerate discrimination in any form. He paused, glancing down at Amelia, who stood by his side, her hand clasped tightly in his. This is for her, and for every child who deserves to grow up in a world where they are judged by their character, not by the color of their skin. The crowd of reporters murmured in agreement, and Mr. Johnson turned to walk away, Amelia by his side. As they walked toward their car, Mr. Johnson felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had fought for justice, and he had won. But more importantly, he had set the wheels of change in motion. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about building a better future for his daughter, and for all the children who would come after her. He squeezed Amelia's hand gently, and she looked up at him, her eyes bright with hope. "We're going to be okay, Daddy," she said softly. Mr. Johnson smiled down at her, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, baby girl," he replied, "we're going to be okay." And for the first time since that terrible day in the store, Mr. Johnson truly believed it. They were going to be okay. The future was uncertain, but together they would face whatever came next, with strength, with courage, and with the knowledge that justice, in the end, always prevailed. But justice doesn't always come easily. In the end, the truth was revealed, and those responsible paid the price. Yet the scars remain, reminding us that the fight against prejudice is far from over. What would you do if this was your child? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories and check out our other videos. You won't want to miss them.